Hello, this is Mr. Galley from GCSE English Revision Pod with a quick message for you. If you want even more English Revision Pod in your ears, you can now subscribe to our premium service, GCSE English Revision Pod Plus, where for the price of just over £2 a month, on top of all the amazing free episodes which will continue to be free and there for you to use, you can also get a selection of amazing bonus episodes on things like Macbeth, A Christmas Carol, Romeo and Juliet, and all your favourite topics covered in the depth and detail that you are used to. If you are interested in getting even more GCSE English Revision Pod, all you've got to do is click the link at the top of this episode description where you can subscribe to GCSE English Revision Pod Plus. Hello and welcome to GCSE English Revision Pod. I am joined as ever by my good friend and co-podcaster, Mr. Forster. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. We've got even more cushions tonight, so the sound should be beautiful.
Bouncy.
Soft.
Oh yeah, I've created a little sort of throne for the iPad made of cushions. So I'm hoping that that's going to deliver from an audio perspective.
As soft as the sound from a coffin, perhaps in a grave. Because what theme are we doing today?
Well, as sort of terrifyingly bad as that link was, I think it's kind of fitting, really, because we are dealing with the most terrifying of subjects, which is death. You know, the only certainty in life, the fact that one day we won't be here anymore.
That's a nice thought. I mean,
a huge relief to some of our listeners.
Why are we putting our time in podcasts?
Do you know what's the other one that I slightly off topic, but the other one I think is quite poetic, but people say it sometimes, that one day, unless you do something so sort of incredible or so terrible, I suppose, as well, that it will live on through the continuation of history, that at some point in the future someone will say your name and then your name will never be said ever again.
Well, that's interesting. A brief aside before we start. That's the premise of one of my favourite short stories by the neuroscientist David Eagleman. He writes a series of visions of death. He's an atheist neuroscientist, and he writes all these vignettes about different visions of heaven from an atheist perspective. And one of them is you stay in this waiting room until someone says your name for the last time, and then you kind of like have the relief evaporating. And then there's like, Jesus hanging out there, there.
He's going to be there for a long old time.
But then there's also people who there's like the guy who's got a bridge named after him, and he's stuck there because every time someone goes to the bridge, he's like, "Oh damn it! You stop saying my name."
That's a really good premise. That sounds brilliant. And well, I mean, two people who will definitely be stuck in that waiting room, of course, are the characters of Mercutio and Tybalt.
Indeed. Yeah, so we're looking today at Romeo and Juliet, an extract from Act 3, Scene 1. The question is on death, and we're obviously looking at the two biggest deaths at the centre of the play until we come to obviously the deaths of the eponymous couple at the very end. So the question is, starting with this exchange, explore how Shakespeare presents death in Romeo and Juliet. So probably good time now to download the handout, isn't it? So click on the link at the bottom in the description of the episode on Spotify or Apple or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You got it?
And then from that, you can see all of the vocabulary we're going to use today, or certainly the more complex vocabulary, the stuff that I don't understand and I have to get Mr. Forster to explain to me. You will see the extract that we've based the question on, and we also give you an overview of how we plan and would write the essay. We tend to follow, because it's this AQA GCSE format, we tend to follow the idea of three big ideas, bookended by a clear thesis statement or introduction and a nice little conclusion at the end. And you can see on the handout how we do all of that. But it would certainly be a good idea, before we continue, to pause this podcast, download that handout and read over the extracts so you have a good idea of what we're about to talk about.
In fact, a great revision way is to actually plan it yourself and then listen to the podcast and be like, what do those guys have to say about it?
Yeah, instant feedback on your work if you do it that way.
Maybe you've just done that now and time has passed, stretched out in that moment. Anyway, shall I read the thesis?
I reckon.
Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is a play saturated with death. From the prologue, we know the fate of the star-crossed lovers whose relationship is death-marked. And by the end of the opening scene, we have seen how, in the dysfunctional masculine world of the two feuding families, death is never far away. Yet what is arguably more disturbing is the way in which Shakespeare seems to suggest that the two fundamental drives impelling human behaviour, love and death, are inextricably and tragically intertwined.
There's some lovely vocabulary in there. There is some lovely vocabulary. And we are not saying, we should stress this, that you have to use words like this in order to be successful in GCSE. But we like to pitch it in such a way where you hopefully, I mean, we know that good vocabulary is the driving force behind good writing, right? So we do try and give you more challenging vocabulary. However, that does not mean that this is the only way to do it. And we will try and unpick it for you as we go through. If I've understood you correctly, Mr. Forster, what you're essentially saying there is that for a love story, there's an awful lot of death kicking around, right? For a story that's, if you went up to 100 people on the street and said, think of a love story, and some of them probably would run away or attack you, but those who did answer the question, you imagine they would say Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, exactly. Just trying to have a nice time. Don't want to have this conversation with you.
Name a love story. Tell me one.
But those who did, those kind souls who would name a love story for you, I think would probably say Romeo and Juliet, right? So if it's the most famous love story out there, why on earth is there so much death?
Yeah, and I think that's my point, that it's disturbing, is that like love and death, these two for a long time in kind of psychology have been viewed as these kind of two drives of human behavior, and in the play they are kind of mashed together, they're intertwined, and I think that's a bit messed up and disturbing and strange, and that's what we're going to kind of explore in the essay, because obviously the best essays all have this kind of like focus. They have an argument in your thesis, because often a difference between those grade 6s and those grade 7s, 8s, and 9s is that the grade 6s say, lots of people die. Here's one death. Here's another death. And they just tell you all the deaths. And like, another person who dies is Tybalt. Oh my God, spoiler, I've not read that bit. But actually a stronger essay says, well, what's Shakespeare saying about death? What's the play doing with death? What's the audience provoked into thinking about death, reflecting on when they leave the theatre at the end of the play?
I always say that to my students. I say the question will never be, is this thing evident in the play, right? The exam board will never ask you, does death exist in the play? Does bravery exist in Macbeth? Does poverty exist in Christmas Carol? The whole point, the very fact that word is in the question tells you that thing is in existence in the play and is a big part of the play. Your job is to say, what is the writer teaching us about that theme, right? What do we know about death after studying Romeo and Juliet? What do we know about death that we maybe didn't know when we started studying Romeo and Juliet? And that's, like you say, the essays that achieve highest grades will have an argument about it. They won't just be saying death is there. They will be saying, well, this is the interesting thing about death in Romeo and Juliet, and this is what you'll learn about death that you maybe won't get from reading other things.
Should we look at the first paragraph? So generally we start with the extract. When it's an extract question, it's a logical place to go. And the extract is obviously on Mercutio's death. So here's the first topic sentence that we'll look at. Mercutio's death in Act 3, Scene 1 is the catalyst, not only for Romeo's transformation, but for a generic shift in the play as it lurches inexorably towards tragedy. So catalyst, what's a catalyst?
So catalyst is a moment. It's in its literal term, it's something that speeds up a chemical reaction, right? But in a more metaphorical sense, it's something which drives something forward. And if I've understood your topic sentence correctly, you're essentially saying that it's a turning point not only for the character of Romeo, but also for the inevitable march that the play is now on towards this grim, terrible ending.
Yeah, because remember, you don't. One thing that I'm not a big fan of with kind of that acronym PEE paragraphs that obviously lots of us do teach lower down in the school is that it can stop you saying some quite interesting points, like big points. It encourages you to look at quotations as kind of small micro things in a play rather than thinking about the whole play. And a big structural point you might want to start with is just the fact that the first two acts of Romeo and Juliet, it's structured very much like a comedy. Because Shakespeare's comedies, people might say, but it's not funny, Mr. Forster. I find it funny, but obviously comedy is something lost. It doesn't age well, does it? Like even things that we found funny in the early 2000s are sadly no longer funny to many of our students. Humour is ephemeral and fleeting. But comedy in the early modern period was often defined by lovers who were separated and who had kind of cunning plans to get together to overcome their families. And that describes, they had a clown who says a load of crap, Mercutio, and what's quite interesting about the first two acts of the play is it's a little different from a play like Much Ado About Nothing, which is a very similar plot, even down to a fake death. Of course, she doesn't die; she comes back at the end. Or you've got, A Midsummer Night's Dream that has, families that stop kids falling in love and they flee to the forest, and some magic happens and they get together at the end. What happens in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is he flirts, he plays with this idea of comedy. But if we see Mercutio, and this is a great kind of phrase you can use in essays, you can use kind of conditional clauses, if clauses. If we see Mercutio as the figure of the clown, flamboyant, extravagant, filling Romeo's world with banter and optimism, his death in this moment signifies a turning point, a shift. And that's kind of marked out in the language as well. Because one thing I always kind of like to analyze when we're looking at a play, it's always worth thinking about the staging. What does it look like on the play? And also, given the play is written in poetry, in verse, it's worth looking at the rhythms of that poetry. So if we start with the latter, we call it prosody. He's killed, and then he's stabbed, and his first line is an incomplete line of blank verse. I am hurt. So suddenly the rhythms of his poetry is broken. Mercutio, who couldn't stop talking earlier in the scene, who had all these things to say, is silenced. And when you're an actor in the early modern stage delivering an incomplete line of blank verse, you're creating a pause. So it's a lovely point to make. It's just simply that the line "I am hurt" creates, by being incomplete, this pause. And what's that doing in that moment, Mr. Galley? What do you think's happening there? Like, why?
I suppose, I mean, it's almost like a sort of linchpin, isn't it, around, you could say, the whole world of the players turning in that moment, right? You're seeing perhaps there's a horrible simplicity and reality to death, which is shocking them all out of this world of, even you go back to sort of Romeo's oxymorons, the Queen Mab speech that Mercutio gives. There's all this language that sort of plays around with meaning and invites different interpretations, and everyone's being very clever in what they're saying, and there's space and there's room for wordplay, and all of a sudden, in that incredibly short 3-word line, that incomplete line of verse, like you say, it's almost like the whole universe of the play is collapsing in on that moment. Is comedy is becoming tragedy right before your eyes.
Yeah. His language is just factual. I am sped. Is he gone and hath nothing? It's a series of these short factual statements that are so different from his earlier kind of brash language. And then, of course, he then shifts into prose. He shifts away from poetry into prose to make a series of jokes that no longer are funny. He puns on the word grave. Say, tomorrow you'll find me a grave man. And the man who couldn't, because grave, obviously, it has these two meanings, doesn't it? You can be in a grave and dead, but it also means
grave and serious.
Yeah. And the man who's never been serious, who couldn't say a serious thing, will be grave tomorrow. And the only thing that can make him grave in the serious sense is, of course, death. And the play, too, that becomes grave here. Romeo suddenly says that Juliet's beauty hath made him effeminate and softened valor's steel. It's a horrible metaphor here. It's the metaphor of a sword that's become softened, that's been weakened by love. And it's a rejection of love in this moment. It's a play that's all about love. Mercutio's death is transformed here into a weakening force that challenges Romeo's, he's blaming himself, isn't he, for that death? And then he confronts Tybalt in this moment. To finish off this kind of paragraph, he becomes the hero of a revenge tragedy in this moment. He says, Mercutio's soul is but a little way above our heads. He invokes this idea of a ghost hovering above him and Tybalt as he then stabs Tybalt and kills him. He's transformed from the lover into the hero of a revenge tragedy. So that's probably our first paragraph, really, that what we're really arguing is that love evaporates in this moment, doesn't it? It's overpowered by death.
Could you do something with a sort of masculine energy here? We've seen a sort of a ridiculous form of masculine energy right at the start of the play with Samson and Gregory and the fighting over nothing and all that kind of stuff, which we cover in a previous episode. I'm pretty sure we talked about that before, haven't we? But then the introduction of Juliet actually sort of gives meaning to the world in a more fundamental, and I don't want to say gives meaning in a meaningful way, but I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. But then that sort of feminine energy, which was adding a balance to things that seemed to make some kind of sense of the world, is suddenly gone, isn't it? And instead you've got this
death
masculine.
is more powerful than love. Yeah.
Death is more
death,
powerful than love.
death, death
And
draws him
it's,
back into the masculine world. Is what I guess is the kind of point
yes.
we could say.
So
So that
you
brings us
could
to our,
potentially do. Sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say that like that leads us into our next paragraph quite nicely, which is actually because we're starting by saying this is the turning point, but this is actually a little bit of a counter argument, because the counter argument is that actually, although we're saying this is the movement from comedy into tragedy, before this there's been loads of stuff about death that we just maybe haven't noticed because we weren't looking for it.
The death
So we're setting
haunts
this up,
the early part of the play. The
yeah. So
death is there. Yeah.
there's a great word for that, which is called prolepsis, which our students might want to use. I love a word, 600,000 of them to a million in the English language, as I've said a few
Yeah.
times. And prolepsis is the idea of it's a flash. So a prolepsis is the idea of a flash forward. It's like that promises something to come. It tells you what's going to happen next. So there's these. So we call them these proleptic images. So my topic sentence was this: even before the deaths of Mercutio and Tybalt, the play is full of proleptic images of death.
Would students
So
be wrong to use the word foreshadowing in there, or is prolepsis and foreshadowing similar in meaning?
It's slight, it's subtly different. So foreshadowing, prolepsis is foreshadowing something that is the author does. So that it's, you can say Shakespeare foreshadows through these proleptic images. So the
It's an
proleptic images
active.
are they're how he foreshadows things. The proleptic images are the things that Shakespeare uses to foreshadow. So you could reframe it entirely and say Shakespeare foreshadows the inevitability of death in many images.
Right. I like it. I like it. Yeah.
So
I'm gonna pretend like I always knew that word from now on.
Well, I mean, because let's look at the prologue. The prologue, their love is death marked. What does that metaphor imply? Like,
well, I think the interesting image there is that the word marked, actually, in the sense of you might think of branding or scarring or something, a stain, something permanent, something that you cannot remove. And the idea that love was this wasn't a love that was in danger of being affected by death. This was a love that was bound up in death from its very first moment. There was nothing, there was no power on earth that would have separated death from this love from death, right?
yeah. And it's pretty disturbing, that, isn't it? And then if we look again in Act 1, Scene 4, at the Capulet, before going to the Capulet feast, after the kind of mental stuff of Mercutio about Queen Mab, Romeo says he sees some consequence yet hanging in the stars, and then he says, which must lead in some unfathomable way to untimely death. He seems to kind of predict this is going to go down. And obviously at the moment it seems light. It seems like part of the kind of the meaningless language of Mercutio and Romeo in their banter. But actually, you look back on it and he's right. It is going to lead to untimely death, because the play takes place over a few days. It's going to it takes place over a matter of 3 days, I think. And he is going to face his untimely death. Then in Act 1, Scene 5, Juliet, after sending a nurse to find out Romeo's name, says, "If he be married, my grave is like to be my wedding bed." Why is she talking about graves? She just met the love of her life. So there's all this imagery of like death that just appears. And then after Mercutio and Tybalt die, these references just come in. I'll just name a couple, and then we can talk about the effect of all of them together. So he says, so in Act 3, Scene 5, after they literally just consummated their relationship and had sex, and he's gone down the ladder, she says, "Methinks I see thee as one dead at the bottom of a tomb."
It's strange in that moment to be thinking in those terms.
And even the friar who's otherwise so positive about love, can't help but speak about love devouring death in the moment that he marries them. So all of these moments show how death seems woven into the very fabric of the plot. That's a metaphor you could use, which is perhaps unsurprising, given that actually it kind of reflects the world of the early modern period, in which life expectancy was low. Minor infections could be devastating. Childbirth was perpetually hazardous. Plague swept through London. And the last outbreak was in 1593 to 94, which is just before Shakespeare would have started work on Romeo and Juliet. Death is present in the early modern world in a way that perhaps it isn't quite so present in our world. Obviously, we become aware of it, particularly as we get older, but it doesn't have that same kind of ubiquitous.
You don't feel lucky. Well, maybe I was about to make a really sort of ignorant generalization, but for a huge amount of people in the sort of developed world are lucky that they don't have to go through their life feeling like it might be snatched away from them with relatively
Yeah.
or there are a lot of different ways that your life could end without much warning. You know, for most people, you
Of
don't
course,
have to
tragically
live in
not for all
constant
people,
fear of
but you know,
disease, or absolutely, that you could be in danger of making a huge generalization there. But I suppose it's safe to say that we can't really relate to what that was like for them. We would struggle to know how prolific death was, and also how sort of quickly and from nowhere it was able to strike in such huge numbers. Would a good way of summarizing that paragraph then is this: essentially, you've made your first point about that death serves as a huge turning point. It seems to drain away any energy associated with love. You might make the link with femininity, and or certainly a feminine energy and love. You might talk about that death reverts Verona to this very masculine destructive world. Your second point though is then saying, while I've just said that this death is a key moment, that there's a really strong turning point centered around this death, actually a deeper study of the play shows you that death is not something that dives in for this one destructive moment. Death is constantly hanging around, and the characters themselves are forever foreshadowing it. They're forever letting these images slip in when they're perhaps not even meaning to.
and then I guess then the final evaluation of that at the end of that paragraph, which is often nice to do, is just that this actually shouldn't be surprising because in the early modern period, death was
Yeah,
incredibly close. And actually,
yeah,
we shouldn't be surprised that love and death are intertwined. It seems strange for me, from my privileged position, where perhaps I don't think about death all the time. Perhaps not such true of all of our listeners, but certainly for me it is. And that's it's an alien world to me that Shakespeare's perhaps opening up. So I
yeah.
guess it brings us to our last paragraph, which is developing that point a bit further. Yet perhaps what is most more disturbing is the way in which Romeo and Juliet's love story exists always in the shadow of death. So I guess it's a really simple point, this, that actually we're going to unpick this shadow of death a little bit more in this paragraph, develop that last idea. Because the first one is to go back to that prologue again. The prologue says they are star-crossed, and it talks about how they come from the fatal loins of these two foes. If we unpick those two images, star-cross implies kind of a malign horoscope. The stars are crossed against them. That their fortunes are in the stars. They're screwed. It's not going to end well for them. But fatal loins to me is even more disturbing because that fuses love and death in a very physical sense. Because of course, loins are how can we say this in a polite podcast friendly way? Genitalia.
Yeah.
And if they're fatal, we're talking about the moment here of conception, the moment when Lord Capulet and Lady Capulet
Create
made
life.
love, created life. But from that moment, it was fatal. So there's this horrible sense that actually, from that moment of conception, of birth, Juliet and Romeo were doomed to die. We see that also death throughout the play is personified as a rival lover, which is even more disturbing. This is a motif that runs it. We often talk about motifs in our podcast. They're a great thing to analyze because you can kind of look them up before you do the exam and use them in kind of lots of different essays. So a motif is this like repeated pattern, and there's this motif all the way through the play of death as a rival lover. So in Act 3, Scene 2, on finding out that Romeo's been banished, Juliet says, "Death, not Romeo, shall take her maidenhead," which is an awful image of death taking her
horrible,
virginity.
isn't it? Yeah.
Then on finding his daughter dead, seemingly dead in Act 4, Scene 5, she's of course not dead, Capulet, she's faking it, but Capulet says to Paris, "The night before thy wedding day hath death lain with thy wife. She has been deflowered by him, and that death become his son-in-law and his heir." This is a horrible, it's the same metaphor, but death is a lover who's taken Juliet from both Romeo and Paris in this image. And likewise, then in Act 5, Scene 3, in the tomb, in that final scene, where Romeo comes into the tomb and he sees Juliet, and he sees her beauty, and his explanation for her beauty when she's supposedly dead, even though she's not. He says, "Shall I believe that unsubstantial death is amorous, and that lean abhorred monster keeps thee here in the dark to be his paramour?" So a paramour is, of course, a lover. So again, it's this same, Juliet, Capulet, and Romeo have picked up upon the same motif of death as a lover. And it just shows that the death, in a way, this actually actualizes something that is true of the play, really, is our final point. That death is a rival lover. Death is this other force pulling Romeo and Juliet away from each other. Love pulls them together, and death does inevitably pull them apart.
Yeah. And so death, really, your third paragraph then is almost developing on your second paragraph. Really, it's sort of
Absolutely.
taking the idea that um, death is very visible in the language of the play from a range of characters, but you then you sort of take that point and you really hone it in paragraph 3, and you say,
And
well,
say why.
actually, yeah, here's a more specific motif where death is this love rival to Romeo, and of course, if death is your rival, you're up against it, really, aren't you? I mean, you're
You're not
not
going
going
to
to win
win.
that one.
Yeah.
You're not Chelsea going into the League Cup final tomorrow, terrified of what Liverpool are about to do to you. You are no, the other way around. I've just stitched up my own team with my
Yeah.
misuse of a clumsy metaphor. So whatever happens tomorrow, I've already lost
It's your
in that
fault.
regard.
Of
Yeah,
course, our
it will
listeners will already
be.
know this has happened because they're listening from the future.
Yeah. They
So
could be
it's not
listening a
tomorrow
long
for them,
way
it's
into
the
the future when
past.
the 2023 League Cup final is not perhaps the hot
When
topic of the
Liverpool are in
day.
Sky Bet League One.
Yeah, well, I mean, who knows? Who knows where it's gonna? Who
Who
knows what the
knows?
future holds? And indeed, who knows what the conclusion holds? Well, we do because Mr. Forster's wrote it, but you might not know yet. And what we'd recommend is, if you have not read that bit of the handout, writing a conclusion is a tricky business and a really easy way to practice it. Having now listened to everything we've said, why not write your own conclusion before looking at the one on the handout? So think about all the things we talked about. Think about summarizing them into a 2 or 3 lines, and this is the tricky thing with conclusions. You don't just want to regurgitate everything that's already
Yeah.
been said. You're not just doing it again.
So what I like to do is leave them with one final thought, which I've kind of put on the
Mm,
handout here. And the final thought for me that I want to leave the examiner with is that the play ends with the reactions of the two families to the deaths of Romeo and Juliet, and the reactions are so inadequate. They both talk about building statues in pure gold of the two lovers, as if that will somehow, atone for this awful
yeah,
loss.
yeah.
And so the final reaction death we have in the play is just so inadequate to the
Mm,
tragedy that we've seen. And Shakespeare therefore perhaps leaves us reflecting on how we respond to death, I think.
yeah, I like that. I like that. I think that's a good ending. Oh, all this talk of death. Hey, what what an uplifting way to spend your Friday evening. But we Saturday evening. Sorry, either
But
way.
not for the
But
listeners. They could be listening on Tuesday or Wednesday.
they're
It's
free.
still a
They're
podcast.
free from the confines of this. Yeah, I don't know why I'm sort of going on
And
as if this is
perhaps
some
through this
kind of
podcast, we
live.
ourselves will transcend death. That, in many years'
Maybe
time, you and I in the grave and listeners still studying Romeo and Juliet could hear the voices
would
echoing through
still
time.
stumble across this. That'd be something, wouldn't it?
Isn't that an interesting
Um,
thought?
it is. It is
Immortality.
achieved in the weirdest possible way. But anyway, listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of GCSE English Revision Pod. You can contact us. We are on Twitter at the letter G Revision Pod. You can email us, Mr. Forster, can't you?
I looked it up this time because I've got it last time. EnglishRevisionPod@gmail.com, he says, reading from his screen.
I genuinely, we do love getting them. We're sorry, we know we're not the best at replying, and we don't get back to all of them, but we have had some really lovely ones, and we've
And some weird ones. We
particularly
have some
amazing
really,
hearing.
really weird ones sometimes.
We do. I mean, did you remember that one that basically said that I needed to shut up and you needed to
I texted
talk
Mr. Galley
more?
straight away, be like, get a load of
Yeah,
this.
yeah. I can't remember the name of the person who sent it, but they certainly didn't mince their words. But no, genuinely, we had some lovely ones about people who've not been able to attend school for health reasons and things like this, and have been using the podcast to help them through. And we do, even if we're not the best at responding, we do love hearing about that kind of stuff. So please do drop us a line and let us know how you're getting on. We will be back, of course we will, with more revision for your ears. And Mr. Forster, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a nice evening.
You too.